Toronto renter, you need to listen to this video very carefully and watch it until the end. This man right here is proposing a new bill that could change how rent control works in Toronto.
Oh my God. It's way overdue. About time. And I am super pumped for this. And I know people are going to freak out about this, but I don't care. So Ontario is finally looking to change the tenancy rules that are so outdated and broken. The system has to work both ways, both for the tenant and for the landlord. We need people to buy rentals, or there's no supply.
You know, if you're in a rent-controlled apartment in Toronto or in Ontario, you might be in trouble because there's new changes coming to the Ontario rental market that could also cascade into the rest of the country as well, because it is the biggest population base in all of Canada, and sometimes a lot of provinces like to see how the bigger provinces are handling things and they implement them later on as well. So we have a lot of videos of people reacting to this new bill, Bill 60 here, and we're going to watch their videos and also react. But if you guys don't know what this bill actually is, I'll do a little bit of a breakdown here. Bill 60, Fighting Delays Building Faster Act 2025. This legislation was introduced in October 2025 with the stated goal of speeding up housing construction and addressing issues at the Landlord and Tenant Board. The bill initially included proposals to change Ontario's security of tenure rules, which sparked significant public outcry from tenant advocates. Proposed changes for tenants: limiting protections. The government's briefing note suggested exploring options that could allow landlords to end leases at the expiry of the fixed term, which was seen by critics as a way to weaken and end rent control. That would definitely suck if, the next month your rent goes up by 50% because of the changes to this bill. That is definitely a harsh reality people are going to have to face potentially if this bill actually fully goes through legislation. Risking counterclaims. Proposals are sought to limit a tenant's ability to raise new issues or file counterclaims at the LTB eviction hearings unless they had paid a portion of the alleged unpaid rent. Now, as of right now, there has been some government walkback following significant public opposition. The government reversed course and announced it would not be proceeding with consultations on changes to tenant security or tenure. But that doesn't mean that they won't walk it back further. They're definitely testing the water here, and it looks like rent control could be gone in the near future. It's something they've been trying to get rid of for a long time, and I feel like eventually they're going to actually succeed in that department. With that being said, let's react to some people talking about this bill.
Oh my God. It's way overdue. About time. And I am super pumped for this. And I know people are going to freak out about this, but I don't care. So Ontario is finally looking to change the tenancy rules that are so outdated and broken. The system has to work both ways, both for the tenant and for the landlord. We need people to buy rentals, or there's no supply, and we cannot rely on developers to build rental apartments. There needs to be the mom and pop shops, those that own 1 to 5 units that they rent out. We also need investors willing to buy dozens of units from builders to rent out. You don't have to like this concept, and I know people are going to freak out in the comments, and I don't care, but there are a ton of buildings in receivership that are paused or even canceled because no one is buying them. We need those units built. Okay, Ontario, we need those units built. This is a circular problem. Builders build because investors buy, because Rick and Amy rent, because the laws and regulations work, because the government keeps them updated, because the builders build, and so on and so forth and so on. When things are really outdated, when things don't make sense, when things are broken, part of the chain breaks, and then what do we end up with? Buildings downtown that are half built and stopped. Projects that were supposed to be started 2 years ago, paused. Buildings that are supposed to start now, delayed at least 2 years, stopped. I was at Cloverdale Mall. That project, which normally would have been snapped up in a couple months, probably crazy fast, but that building cannot sell because nobody's buying it. They were supposed to have that built by 2028 is what the agent told me. We'll be lucky to have that project started by 2028. And here's another thing. Personally, I have a tenant who has a property, a triplex, that has not renting it out. They would rather sell the unit, and they refuse to rent it out. They'd rather pay the tax because because once they rent it out, forget about ever being able to sell it, because then they're going to be jammed up. The rules just don't make sense, and a lot of smaller mom and pop businesses and even larger companies don't want to get involved with rentals. Now, again, this has to work both ways. The tenant needs to be protected, and the landlord has to be able to protect their investment. Otherwise, there's going to be no way to buy these units to make sure that the tenant has somewhere to live. Okay. So it does have to work both ways. I'm not anti this, I'm not pro that, I'm not pro that, I'm not anti this. I just want a system that makes sense for both sides so that one, if a tenant's getting screwed, they can be protected, but two, if a landlord's being screwed, they can be protected. Okay, here's some other inclusions with this the bill that they're putting forward. So one, trying to ending evergreen leases, meaning that once right now, if you have a 1-year lease and once it's up, you go month to month and you can basically stay in that place until you move out or the landlord moves in or an immediate family member moves in. And even if, and it doesn't matter how much notice they give you right now, if they want to move in themselves, they have to compensate you. So there's going to be some changes to that. If the landlord does ask somebody to move out and they give them 120 days or more to move out, they don't have to compensate them. Less than 120 days, they do have to give them either a comparable unit or they have to give them 1 month's rent. So now there's a standard in there as opposed to negotiation. The tenants, changes to disputes to the landlord-tenant board. There will be some changes to that, not completely outlined, but one of those changes is that the tenant would have to give advance notice on any issues they're going to raise with the landlord-tenancy board. No new issues without prior warning. So the reason that this is going in place is because, let's say a landlord says tenant hasn't paid. The tenant says they go to the board meeting. The tenant can say, "Oh, there's black mold in the attic." And so what will happen is that appointment, that board meeting will get delayed and adjourned, which means that this process drags out. Landlords continue to get screwed. The tenant in this particular case, if they're right, are being screwed because why would the landlord fix something if they're not being paid? And there's delays and a waste and like just a waste of time and money for everybody, which means all these other appointments are getting pushed out that need to be addressed. We can cut off a lot of time. Yeah, and I guess the last thing for me, which I find mind-blowing in real estate for some reason, is a contract doesn't mean anything anymore. If you start a 1-year contract and it's up, you don't have to move. Then what's the point of the contract in the first place? And if the if the landlord can't remove a tenant, the landlord can't remove a tenant, but there are ways that tenant can get out of any contract immediately. There's some really sneaky little plays that I've heard and I've researched to make sure that they're legit. It's pretty crazy, but it just, again, balance here, people, balance. And it just shouldn't be like a wildly swing, it should be balanced. And then, what other thing, if you stop paying your mortgage, the bank's going to take your house. If you stop paying for your car, they're going to repossess it. If you, there's all these, every other industry, every other aspect of the world, if you don't follow through on your portion, there's repercussions. It just, except for real estate for some reason. Anyway, I want to hear some opinions. I know people are going to lose their minds on this. I don't care. Let me know what you think, because the government says they do want to hear from people. And I do think we make sure everybody can be heard.
That's an interesting take on this. I'm going to show you other people's opinions as well who actually go in the other direction. Basically, what I'm gathering from what he says is that the reason why they're trying to implement these bills is because there's a lot of investors who are not buying these crappy condos that they ultimately want to rent back, because the rental rules in Ontario right now just don't make sense for them, especially considering the fact that the prices are going down, and they want a guaranteed system that works for them. And they feel like this new system might actually work more in the investors' favor, but apparently now they're walking it back, which is really interesting. But it also goes to show that investors really are the ones driving the real estate market, at least for rentals and condos here in Ontario and in Canada. And it's outlined pretty obviously here by the outlash at this bill, because a lot of the people who ultimately would be buying these. So with that being said, let's watch someone else's opinion on what's going on with this bill. It's really interesting. So let's hear this take.
Bill 60 is undoubtedly going to increase the amount of homelessness across the province. If you don't like how stable your housing is, then this bill is for you. In a briefing on Thursday, security of tenure was on the chopping block. When you're renting and you sign a lease, when that lease is up, you go month to month, and your landlord can't evict you without any real cause. The reason that Attorney General Doug Downey wants to remove this is because he says these evergreen leases are just no longer appropriate. It's his belief that removing security of tenure would mean that thousands of housing units would be unlocked because landlords are currently terrified of putting them on the market for fear of bad tenants, although there is no proof of that whatsoever. This is obviously going to impact the most vulnerable people across the province, including seniors who have enjoyed low rent rates from living in the same place for decades in certain instances, people with disabilities, families, newcomers, young families, and honestly, all renters across the province. This bill would also shorten the grace period to issue an eviction notice after rent non-payment from 14 to 7 days. It also means that if a landlord wants to reclaim their unit for landlord-owned use, they no longer need to provide a tenant with compensation as long as they provide them with 120 days notice. Homelessness in Toronto alone has doubled in the last 3 years, and this bill is going to make that much, much worse. It is simply an attempt to squeeze more money out of working class people, evicting them from homes that are affordable into the rental market where they will pay much higher rents, spending less of their money on food, basic necessities, or possibly saving up just so that landlords can make more money. It is absolutely disgusting. Now is the time to start organizing. If you live in a building and you don't have a tenants association, now is the time to start one. Follow local housing advocacy groups, local housing organizations in your neighborhood, in your city, and be sure to keep your ear to the ground because action and retaliation for Bill 60 is coming.
Oh, and it's already happening right now. The retaliation has been immense. They're already walking back a lot of this right now. So here's another person's take on what's happening right now with Bill 60.
Toronto renter, you need to listen to this video very carefully and watch it until the end. This man right here is proposing a new bill that could change how rent control works in Toronto. If you thought rent control protected you, this might change everything. The government is currently proposing a bill that would act in favor of landlords instead of tenants. Right now, rent control applies to most units in Toronto that were built before November 15th, 2018, meaning anything built before this date is rent controlled. However, if landlords are given more flexibility with this bill, it could create loopholes that increase rent beyond their traditional guidelines. And for low and middle income renters, that makes budgeting a nightmare. This bill proposes alternative options for ending residential leases, which means that renters could face uncertainty about how long they can actually stay in their home. Moving costs, deposit, and higher market rate makes budgeting impossible for anyone trying to live within a $60,000 to $70,000 salary, because as we know, an unexpected move can cost over $5,000 in deposits, movers, and fees. If this bill is passed, renters will face higher rent increases, more frequent moves, and less ability to predict monthly expenses. You might be wondering how this actually affects rent control. We know that the government or a landlord cannot make changes to an existing lease. So this means that the pool of rent-controlled apartments gets smaller and smaller as people end their leases and move. Budgeting only works when your housing costs stay stable, but this bill would make financial stability harder to achieve, especially for low and middle income earners. And the takeaway message here is very simple. People in the city, especially renters, need a government and policies that help them financially instead of put them into further debt. And this bill isn't passed just yet, but if it does, it will pose significant challenges for many people. Make sure you follow for more breakdowns just like this, because understanding these bills is the first step to protecting your wallet.
Now, let's read some comments that are about rentals here in Canada, specifically in Ontario. I'm living in my car in Ottawa because I work minimum wage, part-time, and there is no single room that I can rent here. Not becoming homeless in 2026 in Canada is a new goal for most low-income earners in Canada. And if this bill passes, it could also get worse for low-income earners. You definitely have to either stay in your car or build a tent somewhere. But that's the reality of a lot of low-income Canadians, right? If you want to have a decent rental apartment, you're going to have to work multiple jobs, and you still could be on the streets. My rent was $685 a month for a 9-acre farm. Today it's $3,000. That's higher than any mortgage. I don't think it's higher than any mortgage in Canada, but that is a substantial upgrade. I'd like to know what timeline that was, though. $685 a month for a 9-acre farm is really cheap, you know, especially if this was somewhere in Ontario or BC. But to see it go up to $3,000 is ridiculous. That's an increase of at least 5 times, right? But that goes to show how expensive rent is getting here in Canada. So leave your thoughts down below about Bill 60. Do you think it's coming down the pipeline soon? Or do you think there was enough pushback to get this bill completely buried? Leave your thoughts down below in the comment section, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.